One of the quick things I just wanted to run through is I had no idea what to talk about, so that's kind of my first apology. So there's so much to talk about. I think I probably ran through at least 5 different topics within the 40-odd minutes that we've got. So as you can see up here, I had a smattering of cloud, a little bit around collaboration. Culture is actually, I think, quite important. So whenever we talk about innovation, I think we kind of jump to the mechanics of the what, and we don't really talk about the how. So we'll get into that. And last but not least, the cool devices. So I don't think I can do a presentation with Google on it without that. But without further ado, the interesting thing that I like, so I've been in Google for around 3 years, and what I really liked about it was its mission statement, because to me it actually spoke to me and said something tangible for once. And I've been through, as you heard, Sun Microsystems and IBM and Oracle, and I've been a bit of an IT career criminal in that neck of the woods. But to organise the world's information is a little bit aspirational. It's probably not a very trivial thing to go after, so that's kind of nice. But the next 2 things are interesting, and it's making it accessible as well as useful. So I don't know if you guys have been working with IT for very long, but if somebody in IT says, we actually want to make it useful for you, that's probably an innovative, novel type of discussion to be having. And that's certainly inspiring for me, and you'll see that in the theme as we go through some of this as well. But I wanted to take you back from the start, and IT has been a little bit of a funny journey, and frankly, IT's created its problems by its legacy, and I think a lot of you in the room probably have some of that already. So I just wanted to talk to where it started, frankly. Does anyone remember Alta Vista at all? Wasn't that really great? And how long did it take to become not great? Right, because the problem was you could index the globe, and then at some point, it just looked like spam. Right, so you had to keep clicking. You had to go, well, I didn't really find what I was looking for. I'll click to page 2, nope, 3, 4, and you found it eventually. But the reality wasn't effective. So personally, I found Google better because it just had a simple interface, but it actually found what I wanted, and that's the relevancy, right? And the relevancy actually goes to useful. So if it's useful and it's quick and it's simple and fast, that kind of works, right? That, as a consumer, we all do it today. We probably take it for granted that we can pick up our phone, type or talk into it and say, you know, show me where Australian Technology Park is. It'll do it, it'll map it, and it's done. But actually, we came a long way for doing that. If you look at Yahoo, that's another interesting paradigm shift. So if you look at the way it's structured, it's actually like a directory, right? And that's the way it actually specifically designed it. Who here has a white pages that they still use on a regular basis? Case in point? There's usually one hand at least, there's nothing, right? So the reality is you wanted to look up servicing your car, you had to firstly figure out maybe it's car, no, it's automotive, maybe it's under repairs, no, it's not, it's under service category. And the reality was you had to navigate a taxonomy to figure out what you actually wanted to do, right? So that's IT, right? We had a machine engineering way of trying to translate what we need to do. So we kind of re-engineered that at Google, and we said, well, actually what you do is, as a human being, you say, I would like to find a car service place close to where I live. That's actually what you do, right? So right now, what we've done with natural language processing as well is you can talk to it, but you can actually type that in. You don't have to do these Boolean equations anymore, you know, car service and location and service, right? So we've come a long way from that era, and I think it's been a while, but I think it was roughly 1993, right? But the information superhighway, do you remember that? It was this big thing that was just going to envelop us all, and we wouldn't know what to do with it. That was 93. So we've come a long way. We're probably 20 years beyond that point. So what has the internet done for us? And I think that's generated a couple of interesting things for us. I have a 13-year-old son at home who is quite savvy with internet. And I would say it's probably a couple of weeks. Every single couple of weeks, he will come up and say, I believe I've got something wrong. I think I've got, you know, some bizarre eye condition that I've never heard about. But I think that's a common scenario. We've got really cool information at our fingertips. It's really cool, but it's really dangerous. But it's up to us to manage. And I think the information management part of that's kind of interesting. So we've got so much stuff here, and I know for a fact that if anything happens to anybody I know, medical, they look it up, right? They kind of trust what the doctors say, but they look it up. And they actually go into the doctor's surgery and say, look, I've been researching this, and here's what I think is wrong with me. Can you validate what I found, right? So I think it's actually reversed a couple of things for us. but I think this is probably what we expect, right? So we go in there, and frankly, we're novices. As consumers, we're novices, and we try and figure out the information at our fingertips, and how will this actually help me as an individual? And it's personal, right? We think about that personal computer that we used to love and hold dearly to our hearts, and it's become the internet, frankly. It's about personal computing to us as individuals, and nothing hits home like that other than health, right? So it's near and dear. But even though we think we're house, we're probably not, right? We're probably this guy. Or lady, and I didn't have a lady version of this, so apologies. But if you look at search, so Google actually came out with search. That's what it's known for. It's the Xerox of our current era, right? We Google things. And the reality is we do some interesting statistics. You can actually look at what Australia does in search. So you can see that State of Origin was on 20,000 plus searches, and apparently the movie San Andreas is going to do really, really well. But unfortunately, not as many people really wanted to know what the Powerball results were. So they're interesting, but probably not useful. So if you wind that forward, one thing we've actually done quite well is examine flu trends by search. So the interesting correlation here is that we can actually predict flu outbreaks probably 2 to 3 weeks quicker than CDC by the number of consumers actually looking for flu, right? So there's a correlation there, but it's purely accidental. We didn't actually set out to do that, but it just turns out that we can actually graph consumer trends and actually match that. There was another study that was actually done about what people are searching for in search terms, pro and against certain political leaders by state in the US, and that actually correlated to about 95% accuracy in terms of the wins outcome. So it's a consumerism appeal factor there, but it's definitely got some good correlation. The other one, just in the top left-hand side for yourselves. So we put a lot of effort. So making Google look simple is actually quite hard, right? It looks like a nice, simple interface, but behind that, there's a bizarre complexity. Just in Sydney alone, we have roughly about 1,000 people. More than half of that are engineers. So there are seriously really weird Big Bang Theory-like people inside the company that work all this stuff out, work on all the algorithms and figure out how to make that really effective. Knowledge graphs are a big thing for us. So if you're trying to actually get meaning out of data, knowledge graphs is a way of actually finding connectedness. So if I'm looking for Mustang, somehow it knows based on my history that I'm looking for a car, right, as opposed to the horse. So that's actually quite difficult to do, right? If someone just types in a term, you have no idea. And the relevant part of the search outcome is actually that knowledge graph. And that actually goes for mapping. So when you say in Google Maps, I just want to get from A to B, that is also not trivial. And we manage that with time and traffic and everything like that. But the reality is we're finding this space where if you look at Android Auto, which has just come out, you can actually talk to your car and you can say, I want to go to XYZ soccer field on the weekend because that's where my son needs to be, and then I need to track it to the netball stadium straight after that. It will figure that out. And I think that's part of the relevancy and the meaning of the data that we're actually naturally talking about. It was interesting for me. I had a quick look at, I think from a medical perspective, the inventions that we've been doing in this country, and it's been exciting, right? So 1941, which is, albeit a long time ago, the medical use of penicillin, through to ultrasounds, cochlear, and even spray-on skin. So I think the inventiveness in this country has been awesome, right? If you look at it from all other facets, it's things like Wi-Fi. We've been doing some interesting things like the Victor lawnmower, the Hills hoist that we keep talking about. But we've got this real nice culture of innovation, right? And I think that's really impressive to see, but I think we sort of fixated on the invention part of it, and we didn't really fixate on the innovation up until recently. And it's really good to see that theme here happening. Into some of that innovation, so Google Glass is something that we did, obviously, but the wearable devices, that's only just a very old shot here, but the ability to interact with the device, not just actually be notified, is a big, big call. And we're seeing a lot of applications for that. I'm sure you've heard of that already, so I won't dwell on that too much. Actually, I already heard the Minister talk about Fitbit as well, so that there's a trend there, and the interesting consumerism trend for things like wearable devices for health monitoring is what you do with the data. Right? So what's important for me as an individual actually works at a critical mass level. We haven't actually figured that bit out, but I will get to some of that. The reality that you can actually put a smartphone on your chest and get an ECG reading is probably scary, right? Technically possible. I'm not recommending these things, but they're there. But you can get historical graphs on an individual basis. Imagine what you can do if you had that on a much, much broader scale. To kind of take it a little bit scary, and I don't know if you've seen this, but you can actually use an inkjet printer to basically print out a retinal patch for things like retinal degeneration. Now, that's a little bit scary, right? But it's actually taking it to that next step where what can we do to automate or systematize some of the things we're actually looking at for medical health. The other one, which is probably just as scary, is the smart tattoo. So not only is it a smart device, but it's embedded inside the skin. It's actually working off the actual chemical energy within the bloodstream in the skin. So that's taking it yet another step. The other one, which I'm not sure any of you would be really keen to do either, is actually swallow a smart pill, right? So the concept there is it actually started out with a camera inside the phone, inside the actual pill set itself, which will actually record or transmit. And there's a whole lot of innovation done around Bluetooth low energy, so the ability to actually transmit live data out of something that's actually inside you. Probably sounds a little scary, right? I don't know, I'd swallow one today, but the reality is you can. There may be some critical cases where that's possible. There's even talk above and beyond that about, I don't know if it mentions it there, but the ability to actually have instrumentation within the pill. So I don't know if anyone would really volunteer for that right today. But the reality is we're actually investing in that in R&D in general. The other one, which I also heard, which we don't talk about too much, is nanobots. So the idea that you've actually got something flowing inside your bloodstream, it does actually do instrumentation monitoring. It's slightly magnetic, so you can bring it to a patch like a wristband, and it'll actually give you telemetry data and readings back in, and you release the wristband, it actually flows back through the bloodstream again. All slightly scary, a little bit like Star Trek. I have to say there's a lot of nerds inside Google, so they love that stuff. But that's kind of pretty much right there in terms of thinking and where the R&D, certainly in the private sector, has been going. Last but not least, I don't know, has anyone seen this? This is a little bit scary. So this is a smart contact lens that basically examines the tears coming out of the tear duct for diabetes, for blood sugar glucose readings. And that actually transmits, oddly enough. So what you see on the outside is effectively an antenna for Bluetooth low energy readings, and it'll actually transmit. A little weird, yeah. Now to take it a little bit further, because I like to scare you a little bit, is they're actually talking about being able to actually instrument changes to the cornea based on a smart contact lens model as well, right? So it's getting a little bit scary, but the reality is that the devices and the R&D is being pushed. And I think you've already heard this before, but the idea is that consumerism is actually the big push, right? So it's us as consumers wanting to do this because there is a net benefit to me as an individual consumer of it, to my personal health, and then that is driving the behavior across the industry as well. So if you haven't heard of Internet of Things yet, it's another one. But we've got roughly 7.3 billion people on the planet. The forecast clearly is for 50 billion, so it's a very sharp times factor in terms of the number of devices. So monitoring people is one thing, monitoring the devices around the people is another factor altogether. And for health, that's certainly the case. Outside of health, it's massive. If you think about the telemetry coming out of any device, any moving truck, any equipment inside a factory, any logistics, frankly, that's moving in general, it's huge. And I think the challenge is, what do you do with that data? So if you've got 50 billion devices around the planet, streaming the telemetry out of that into something and storing it's one problem. Managing the data and processing it in a reasonable time fashion is probably another thing altogether as a separate body of work. But if you haven't seen it, there's a lot of work around that. We just actually announced, I believe today, there's a Brillo project that we're actually pushing, which is a platform for having low energy device based on low footprint Android, which will fit into Internet of Things. So basically it's just about anything you can think of that's electrical will basically give you a touch point, which will have an IP stack on it. You can talk to it, read off it. But again, all that's quite active and quite real. Again, it's going. If you've heard of RFID tags, it's been around for a while, so it's not exactly anything new. But to give you a little bit of a picture of what that looks like, so that rather scary looking pill, if you were to ingest it, would actually read out something. It's Bluetooth, so the way it actually works is it has to connect to something else that reads Bluetooth, like your smartphone, and will transmit then over Wi-Fi, hypothetically. But you need to be able to store that. But if you can do telemetry, that actually raises some interesting models, right? So if you're looking at solutions for things like how you do telemedicine, how you actually monitor when people actually leave So it's great as an institution for medicine, but that's controlled environment for yourselves once someone enters. Once they're inside it, but then once they leave, what happens, right? And I think that's answering some of those questions. So the problem statement is, how do we have an effective way to actually keep telemetry data on people to either reactively, how would I say it, post-op actually monitor them, but actually pre-op as well, right? So how would you actually have some proactive monitoring that says, well, because you've been brave enough to put a smart contact lens in your eye, we know your blood sugar level's dropping now, right? As opposed to when you feel faint and you start falling over. So there's some really interesting positive side effects to that, but it's a quite exciting model if you look at it. If you're a little bit technically inclined, there's an entire array of technology that's being invented purely around the protocol stacks and how to communicate with styles of devices. So normal Bluetooth that we use will work, but obviously we're trying to build it for low energy, low footprint, low radiation. So there's an entire body of, whether it's blood pressure, thermometers, glucose, there's protocol stacks, there's a lot of activity being generated from the technology sector into specific use cases and how to make that more effective on human beings, frankly. So to cut into something totally different, so we talked about the telemetry of the data, massive amounts of data. Now, the big thing that we keep hearing about is how do we do that? A, how do we ingest it? How do we store it? So, the quick picture here is, I don't know if anyone recognizes this, but it's a power plant, right? So the analogy is for all of us as consumers, you imagine the scenario that you wanted, for some reason, to go into a department store and buy a toaster. Very simple, right? So what do you do today? You actually literally go to a department, buy a toaster. You go home, you plug it in, right? Now, that works on one level, and that is that the electricity coming out of your home has been standardized. Its uniformity provides you the safety to know that you can buy anything and plug it in and it just works. And the reference I gave you right at the very start, where IT is probably a little bit at fault for this, is we have created a stack in terms of IT, which pretty much everyone on the globe is running, even in your home, right? So everyone in their house has some sort of desktop or a laptop. It's running a certain configuration of CPU. It's running a certain configuration of RAM, memory, operating system, application stack, patching. We do that as consumers, which I find hilarious, because we don't need to, right? If you're interested in it, it's awesome. I spent weeks trying to install Red Hat, version 3 when it first came out on a laptop. It was okay as an exercise, but if I actually wanted to do something, I don't want to be fiddling around with that. And I think the analogy for us, particularly around cloud computing, is it's a utility service. If I've got something, I just want it to run, work, store, process, just make it happen. And I think that is the big thing that's a bit of a game changer. Cloud's actually been around since 2008, so it's not exactly brand new. The real facet to this is if I have a program of work I want to run, I just plug it in and it runs. So it's very similar to that toaster model. Right? We don't want to be reinventing IT stacks every time we think about a new project. And there's places for this, obviously, so we don't say it works for everything. But clearly there are models here, which means you don't really have to focus on the business of IT. You have to focus on the business of health, right? And I think that's quite important. If we can have that discussion, it makes a lot of sense. So to visualize that, that's pretty much, if you're running a big operation inside your organizations, that's what you're running. I know because I was installing a lot of it for the last 20 odd years, so that's pretty much what we do, right? We take it from the ground up, we give you lots of different stacks to play with. It's like a little hobby horse for me, so it was great at the time. But I think if you're running multiple versions, multiple dependencies, if you have to patch something, really, you have to cross your fingers because you hope that when you patch something, it doesn't break something else. So that intricate little matrix of everything that everyone's running is really difficult. It's not trivial, right? There's a lot of science into how you make this work. And the reality is, you have to ask yourself, do you need that for everything, right? And that's the big question. So the model of that for the digital age today with cloud is everything's as a service, whether it's infrastructure, platform, software. It's a plug-and-play model. So if I want to run a load of even an operating system, I can wrap that around and throw that in the way it currently is, which we call lift and shift. or you can refactor and just go general purpose. So there's a lot of platforms out there. There's CRM, ERP, you can, financial, accounting systems. It's pretty much all geared to keep it lightweight. A lot of the innovation happening in the country now is actually like some of the mobile applications that were awarded a little bit earlier. It's about how to make it easy and accessible, right? So Invoice2Go is actually a little Australian startup as well. So anything that allows people, while they're on the move, to be able to operate something like generating invoices on the fly and just have it happen automatically is going to be a positive. So just to give you an inside view, this is what we look like internally. So this is just one aisle of one of the data centers that we run. We manufacture our own hardware, our own software, networking stacks, and this is probably one of the larger ones, but there's roughly millions of servers within each of these. If you think about all the effort it takes to keep the lights on, operate, patch it, life cycle, in an operation this big, you're actually failing a hard drive with its failure rates, probably 1 on every 5 minutes. So if you think about it, there's somebody running around with a trolley, picking up dead ones, putting in new ones. This is what we do, and we're hoping that you don't have to, right? So that's our job, we think, and our job is to provide that service for you, but we don't think you need to be running around keeping the lights on just like this. Again, we run our own networking globally, which is another thing which takes up a lot of money, time, and effort, but effectively one of the largest ISPs on the planet. And just to give you an idea, probably one of the prettiest cooling I've seen inside a data center, but that's what it takes to run that sort of infrastructure, and clearly it's not for everyone, but we run a globally distributed, multi-tenanted public cloud infrastructure, right? For pretty much everything we do. Whenever you do Google search, this is pretty much what it's running on, right? So as consumers, we kind of take that for granted, but we make sure that we have a sub-second latency response for every single request, pretty much across the whole range of services using this global infrastructure. So it's non-trivial. Like I said, a lot of Big Bang Theory folks are working that out, but that's what we do. To give you an idea in terms of the services, so there's around 1 billion searches happening, 100 hours of YouTube uploaded, and I have to say there are a lot of cats up there. Android certainly has taken off. So we've been doing actually one of the big things we did, we gave Android away for free. So we said, look, this market's not really disrupting enough. We'll put an operating system out there and we'll give it away. And we've seen that I think the global stats are something around 78% in terms of Android penetration in the marketplace. Australia's kind of a bit funny, so we're around 50-50 with Apple. Which is okay because everyone needs competition, but it's interesting to see the disruption play happen on that global stage. Google+, which is social, and Chrome actually is interesting. So everyone, when we went and said, we're putting a browser on the market, they went, why? All right, because we had Internet Explorer, we had Firefox, we had Safari. It's now one of the most popular browsers on the planet as well. And simply to that tenet why search became popular, it was fast, simple, and it just worked. And Google Maps, which is actually a Sydney-based company that Google acquired back in 2003, so yet another good example of invention and innovation from our local shores. To spin it a little differently, just to encapsulate that, Gartner probably put it most succinctly from what I found. So there's a nexus of forces, and what they mean by that is simply mobile, social, and cloud and information. Those 4 things. Now, each on their own, I think most of us have considered, well, what do we need to do with mobile, right? Mobile's great, we need to have apps. And then separately, what do we need to do on our social strategy? And so on and so forth. But the interesting thing is if you consider the actual collision of all of those, right? If you can consider how do you have a mobile app with social integration that actually combines a cloud-based backend that has meaningful information managed out of a massive amount of data repository. That's actually not trivial, right? But if that's the problem space you're trying to hunt for, what Gartner's really pushing out here is that's really where you'll find the biggest bang for buck and the biggest impact. So we talked about massive data explosion, so I thought it was interesting to see. There's a bit of conjecture around this. So roughly it's either 500 years or 1,500 years. There's a bit of a debate. But paper was generated roughly around that era, right? Now, in that era, over that 500-year period, 5 exabytes. So basically, roughly, your desktops roughly are running about a 1 terabyte hard drive in terms of storage. An exabyte is about 1 million of those, to give you an idea of the order of magnitude. We're now doing 5 exabytes probably every 2 days. And again, there's conjecture about whether it's 5 or 12. But the reality is we are creating so much content as consumers today, it's being stored somewhere. And I think that's also the secondary problem that we're alluding to. And bringing it back to health, you're really top middle in terms of healthcare providers. But in terms of big data, which is that new other buzzword in IT, so how do you manage and analyze that data and make it useful? But it is certainly pushing out there in front. And in terms of the potential value versus the actual ease of capture, so they're both debatable points. But you would say that consumerism, being able to store all that data or donate it or on an opt-in model is probably one of those areas to push for. Again, this came out of the US, but out of a $3 billion potential value in terms of healthcare, I thought it was actually interesting. The real big target up here is clinical, pretty much out of all of that. So in terms of big data and where we can see the big bang for buck returns, we're seeing really R&D is picking this up quite in a big way. So most of you use Google Maps. The other thing we think is underutilized is actually data visualization, for lack of a better word. So we can get massive reports and spreadsheets, but that looks fascinating, but it's very, very hard to analyze, right? Being able to put that on a map actually makes that quite easy. So we can have a heat map, overlay that with all sorts of data and actually come out with something visual, which never would have happened before inside a spreadsheet. So we're seeing that's quite interesting as an area. So you can do things like this, for example. You can plot the number of outbreaks and instances based on location. You can talk about where the various shifts are. You can overlay that with weather map data and see if there's a correlation in that, for example. Speaking of which, so just a quick example here. So in the retail sector, what they actually found was they could overlay meteorological data and sense when snow patterns were coming in. And they actually found there was a massive correlation for that neck of the woods, which looks like north, where you had a massive spike on people actually buying alcohol just before it snowed. And obviously there wasn't a lot of sunshine and they had to compensate somehow. But the reality was, in the retail sector, they found that if they could predict where the weather maps were coming and you know snowfall is going to happen, they could actually forward order in terms of distribution in advance to prepare for those things. So the interesting model here is, what if you could actually do some of that interesting mashup collaboration? What if you can get instances of sports games like State of Origin, for example? Or you could do all sorts of incidents matching historically over time and overlay that with incidents actually happening with emergencies, right? So there's some interesting ideas that are happening, but frankly, they're very organic at the moment. Now, zettabytes is another thing, but I won't go into that. That's actually 1,000 exabytes. But the reality is, I actually like this very thing on the bottom here. So 10 years from now, when we look back at how this era of big data evolved, we will be stunned at how uninformed we used to be when we made decisions. That actually, I think, is quite telling, right? So when we look at what we make decisions on is based on the data we have. So the question I put to all of you is, do we have the right data to actually make the decisions we're currently making? All right? I would assume no, uninformed, just like this. But the reality is there's a lot of data and we don't actually think it's relevant, but we don't know that until we find it. And that's kind of a very unknown situation to be in. And the reality is a lot of the work I've done with some big data people that are actually implementing within organizations is it's exactly the same. They don't know until they look at the data and see a particular pattern by accident whether they need to correlate that or not. All right? And I think we're probably in that same model. We can gather the information, but we can't actually extract the meaningful data out of it until we see it. And it's very organic, but I think that's a bit of a practice that we haven't really evolved in solving yet. So in terms of the questions to ask, and I think, again, it's probably telling. So storing the data is one thing, and do you have a trusted partner to be able to do that too? Is it scalable? But again, the meaning is interesting. So information is probably a well overused word, right? So we take data for information. The reality is it's really, really easy to get data. You can get it from anywhere, right? You can buy it, you can ask for it, you can extract it. But to actually extract meaning, it implies analysis. And that's really tough. So when you hear about BigQuery, it's actually about the analysis, which is quite important, and also have to add the timeliness for doing that. To bring it back into a real-life example, chronic disease management, I know, has been a big topic for over a decade at least, but the reality is some of these US figures only just came out. So Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield Byers as a VC over in the US, only just released this report a couple of days ago, so it's fairly fresh. But the reality is, if you look at the amount of spend that happens around cardiovascular, diabetes, obesity, cancer, it's massive. And I think as a healthcare system, it's about how we apportion costs to manage those things. As consumers, it's a little bit more down to earth. It's how do I actually proactively figure out I can find out about these before it actually gets to a really critical stage. And the reality is there's a lot of companies listed under there that actually invest in that particular area. But you think about those examples that I referred to earlier around telemedicine, right? So what if you actually had Fitbit not actually just monitoring the fact that you are active, but you've actually got some health telemetry coming out of it, right? What if it actually said, well, you know what, we're actually, we're detecting there's a bit of an imbalance in some of the hormone levels, you may want to get checked out, right? So the challenge I think for all of us today is how you balance that technology, right? So you've seen some rather scary things that you can do. You can ingest some pills with cameras in them or otherwise. But the reality is we want to be able to get to a stage where it's an opt-in model. One of the historical challenges we've seen is obviously patient privacy is key, and we've seen that globally. But there's kind of a weird little contradiction in terms there. So you want to protect the privacy, but then you want to enable the information to protect them again. So I don't think we've solved that. To give you an example out of actually Larry and Sergey, who are the founders of Google. So ironically, both of them have a personal story. So Larry actually had an infliction with his throat where it was partial paralysis. And he actually went quiet, literally went quiet, went off the air. We didn't see him for about 12 months. He eventually came back out and he said, look, I didn't really want to make a big fuss. So my idea was to lay low. Sergey came over to me and said, look, you've got to talk about this thing. You've got to say what you've got. You've got to put it out in the open, be transparent. So he said, look, fair enough. So eventually when he came out, he was actually surprised because the doctors were all telling him, look, this thing's really rare. No one has it. You know, and everyone loves that story, right? When you go into a doctor's surgery and they say, nope, just you. So he had at least, I think, from memory, about 1,000 people actually poll him after that and say, me too, right? So that was a very interesting scenario where he was being told on the one hand, no records of this, you know, it's like a 0.01% thing in the globe. But just because he came out with it, he was actually told rather organically, yes, we've also got it. So he actually started correlating the data from all those people and they were opting in their personal records as well. And they managed to put a case together and say, right, you know, we can see some patterns in here, we can correlate the treatments, where it's successful, where it's not. That wasn't terribly easy to do. There's not a lot of times where, you know, none of us are like Larry, right? We can't get on a global stage and say, I've got this thing that I don't know anything about, who else has it? If we can get to that state, how much better would life be, right? So Sergey had something very similar. So he had a medical test which predicted that he would get Parkinson's by the age of 70. So he naturally panicked because no one wants Parkinson's if you know about it. So he's invested in a whole lot of technology to be able to do that. Now it sounds a little bit weird, but bear with me. We've actually done some R&D investment into a company which actually compensates for the wobble in your utensils when you're trying to feed yourself if you have Parkinson's. So if you've ever seen that, my grandmother had it, but it was very difficult. But we are looking at all sorts of various investments in time to actually solve unique things, and that's certainly just a couple of examples out of that. So just on that example, we've seen genome examples and DNA sequencing, but I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on that. The reality is we've seen certainly the cost decreasing rapidly, and we've seen the number of genomes being processed increase rapidly. So roughly around 10 years ago, it took a cost of $3 billion to do one single genome sequence, which I don't think is affordable for a lot of us in the room. Today, it costs roughly around $25 to store a genome sequence. To actually sequence it, it's probably costing about $1,000, but just in terms of raw compute. So we've gone from $3 billion to roughly $1,000 within about a decade. Now, the increase also of storing genomes is quite impressive. So the reason we do that is if we can actually get a database, frankly, of gene pools and correlate incidences that are arising and outbreaks and be able to group that and correlate that with treatment data, that would be a very interesting globe to live in, wouldn't it? We'd be able to say, I've got this really bizarre thing, no idea what it is, no one knows about it, but the global database would just say, yes, somebody in Estonia's got one, and they were successfully treated, right? So that's the panacea. We're a long, long way away from that, but that's certainly what we're shooting for. I won't go on to this too much, but the reality is from an approach of either the programmer, the biologist, or the scientist. There's a whole bunch of things. We've actually released a genomics API as well, just to be able to do some further inroads. This I thought I'd want to show for two reasons. One, I actually thought it was interesting. I did read some excerpts out of this book Dr. Eric Topol actually authored, called The Creative Destruction of Medicine, which I thought was quite controversial. But then he sort of followed that with how the digital revolution will create better healthcare. Now, the interesting sequencing here is that he's basically overlaid binary with, you know, the four major components of gene pool slicing. But the reality is we've come from an era where it's just having IT in general was just an absolute blessing, to the fact that we're now going to this massive nexus of forces with social, mobile, and cloud, into this era where we're into this massive incline. So, you know, whether it's correct or not, right, if we can get to 2020 and we have 64 million human genomes actually in the database, that's not bad, right? But there are some interesting challenges technically with that, and that's frankly why we're investing a lot of time and effort. To bring it back down to earth again a little bit, instead of that blue sky. So if you had to compensate and contrast traditional pharmaceuticals with, I guess, the innovators in that area, if you're looking at how much it costs, so the traditional data center model that I looked at, so basically just to keep the lights on, $350 million a year, excuse me, versus about $1 million to purchase data itself instead of acquire it. And the time to actually market, now the time to market is big, even in manufacturing, and I was presenting at a manufacturing industry conference, roughly 2 to 3 years is about product life cycle for them. But if you can shorten that and actually do some innovation, you might have heard some terminology like agile methodology versus waterfall. If you're a programmer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm guessing there's not a lot in the room. But the reality is you can fail fast, which is what we talk about at Google. So fail fast is a little bit scary, right? So imagine you go back to your office and you go, right, we're all going to fail really fast. You can imagine, right? The reaction isn't brilliant, but the thinking behind that is, wouldn't it be really great if we just prototyped, tried it out, figured out if we're having early successes, rake it back in, reiterate, and keep going. So agile methodology just talks about launch and iterate, right? So if we can get to a better outcome by learning failure faster and then getting to a more succinct, improved end result, that's the main goal. I won't go into this too much, but it really talks about, I guess, the scale of the problem, 600,000 drugs and how to find out 570 human proteins matched to 7,000 chemical pockets before you go into human trials. Life sciences has this exact problem. If you look at the number of years it takes right down the bottom, right, 3 to 6 years on drug discovery, preclinical, 6 to 7 on clinical. These are the times to market effectively in the commercial term. Right, so if we can start contracting that down, just because we've got the compute power to be able to rationalize that front end of the problem, I think we'll be going a long way. Real-time patient intelligence is another one. So if you can do some predictive analysis about where things are heading instead of where things have been, is definitely an area to kind of look at. And on that theme, I just wanted to just put a quick example here of National Health Service in the UK. So I did some work with them probably back in my Sun Microsystems era around their National Spine project for how they actually integrate all their data management systems. But the reality is, Agile is mentioned right up here as well, but they did their first release cycle in 4 weeks. So many of you have your own projects, right? If someone said, right, we're kicking a project off and we're releasing in 4 weeks, how does that sound, right? But the reality is they did that Agile model, and they live with that for the life cycle of their entire project. But live within 5 months was kind of a big innovation for them. And their model was really to not only build a national intelligence network, but also to be able to go down granularly to each organization and be able to delve into statistics. So not only could you do comparison statistics across organizations, but you can actually compare that across the national average, which is a great tool as well. Wanted to do a quick call out for a couple of books. Excuse me. So I don't know if anyone's actually seen this particular one. I thought it was interesting. It actually talks about innovation from a cultural perspective. So my earlier comments was You can do the what we're going to do in innovation, but the how is actually intrinsically important. So one of the big things certainly Google's known for is its culture. We definitely do things differently. We go out of our way to do things differently, but it's all built on this culture and innovation. And some of these circles give you some ideas, but effectively a permanently learning organization. So if you think about the agile methodology I spoke about, it's launch and iterate. And this really talks to how do you manage that on several different fronts inside an organization. There is a link for a PDF there, but certainly specific to health. Another one I read, which I actually quite liked, was High Velocity Edge. So it does go a long way into taking some case studies. So it talks about Toyota from a manufacturing industry, but it also talks about medical examples, right? So how we actually take for granted that in our own organizations, and especially in the health industry in general, we've just institutionalized some things by default, but they're actually prone to systemic failure. So one of the key tenets up here is dynamic discovery. So if there's a gap analysis and someone said, look, there's a really cool problem we should solve for, it's about tactically just pulling a task force together on the spot, remediating it, and getting on with the job, as opposed to, that's really great, we'll bring that up next week at the next forum, and we'll then put a committee on it, and then we'll figure it out. So the traditional way we actually think about solving problems is actually very core to that cultural innovation change. And frankly, change management, if anyone's been involved in change management in organizational psychology, it's not easy, right? So I'm not expecting anyone to go back in the organization and say, right, we're all going to be innovative, right? It's not easy. In a lot of the cultural change in the workplace that we see, roughly about 30% of project time and effort is actually change management. So if we get that bit right and we culturally change an organization and push it on a different path, the actual rollout and the execution of that innovation actually is a lot more seamless. Collaboration, I just wanted to touch on that. So the interesting thing, I think, for yourselves, if this is applicable for you, we're used to collaborating with ourselves, with our patients in this example, and strategic partners. But the interesting thing here was academia and competitors. So one of the things the Japanese did really well back in the old days was the Keiretsu model, right? So they basically took a community together which were actually competitive on a global market and made them work together and come out with new ideas and actually pulled a way forward. And the other model here, which is coming out quite strongly, is academia. So that strong relationship with the branch of PhDs and other exciting bleeding edge innovation. Just want to leave you on this last one here. So again, out of this VC study that just came out a couple of days ago, but this really does summarize things, I think, probably for the theme you've already heard about, so apologies if it's a repeat. But the shift towards consumer-driven, value-based healthcare is the opportunity for technology solutions. So again, if you think about that nexus of forces, it's the ability for us to innovate on a consumer-driven model, so if it's user-centric or individual-centric, and the ability to combine that social factor with the mobile factor and the cloud factor, right? They're the big key things that we think we're driving. So connected medicine is the big key theme, and the retail angle of that is massive. Probably the hardest thing, and I've talked to apps and wearables, the health exchange. And we've talked about PCHR and other things like that in this country for a long time now. But the ability to have actual exchange of health information is probably the biggest barrier that we've seen. Globally, we actually did publicly try Google Health globally. And that fell down for that very reason, right? It's that contradiction in terms that you want to protect the information, but you also want to free the information. And I will leave you with that challenge. If we can solve for that, that certainly would be a good start. Thank you very much.